Before we begin this morning's proceedings, I'd like to just, for those of you that are actually not familiar with the Leadership Circle, is to provide an overview of the framework. In your bags, there is also a brochure, and it's an orange brochure. You may want to take it out and to have a look at the center page, which gives you a sense of the circle itself. And what I'd like to do is to actually context it in this world of complexity, consciousness, and competence. Every day, in different parts of the world, we are asked by leaders what questions that relate to complexity, questions that relate to consciousness, as well as competence. And some of those questions include, how can I manage more effectively the complexity that's coming at me, that's coming at my team, that's coming at the organization, and do so in a sustainable way as a leader? How can I better expect the unexpected? What I was doing before worked really well, and suddenly it's not working as well as it used to. Is it possible for me to reconfigure the way that I think? Can I think differently? How can I think differently? Is it possible to reinvent? Or is it just a question of going at it harder, faster, and longer? And then often questions like, well, we're really intelligent people here. We've got incredibly skilled, wise people who have enormous qualifications and great technical skill. Why isn't that enough? Why can't we just solve it by just putting all our heads together and just going at it? So those are some of the questions that we actually frequently get asked. How many of you get asked questions like that, by the way, in your own businesses or with some of your clients? And so when we look at the Leadership Circle, the frame is that we are in a context and an environment which provides us with enormous possibility and incredible challenge. Change and the nature of change itself is changing. And with that comes enormous opportunity, freeing those unseen possibilities. What's around the corner? How exciting is that? What's possible in the future? And of course, with that comes, complexity, uncertainty, volatility, ambiguity, disruption. And if we try to do what we've done before, which many leaders are doing in organizations, and it's not working, that tends to be a fairly uncomfortable space because we're facing the unknown. We don't have the answers to everything. And as a result, I don't know, most of the ones I tend to speak to tend to be a little bit like me. It's like, wow, that brings up a sense of anxiety and, fear and vulnerability. And it's in that particular space that the opening video, we specifically chose this opening video this morning by David White. Start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first one, the one you don't want to take. Start close in. The one you don't want to take is often the courageous step. This is the conversation we find ourselves in with leaders around the world. What are Start with your own question. And what are some of those questions? And the leadership circle, some of the questions that we ask leaders is your development as an individual leader? Is your development as a collective of leaders keeping up with the pace of change and the complexity that comes with that? And this is the space where the leadership circle lives. Very consciously, very intentionally designed to allow the conversation, to encourage leaders to develop at the pace of complexity and change. And so this morning, for a short time, I'd like to provide you with an overview of the leadership circle, the framework. For those of you that haven't seen it before, hopefully it can provide you with some insights into the elegance of the design. Sometimes we hear people say that, wow, it looks really complex. And so what I'd like to do this morning is to actually give you a sense of the design of the framework and to actually notice that there is enormous simplicity beyond what actually initially looks like complexity in the model. For those of you that are very familiar with the leadership circle, hopefully this will be a gentle reminder for you of the framework itself. So one of the first questions that we get asked is, why is the leadership circle different from other leadership models? So here's some of the why, and here's some of the how together. Some of the key distinguishing aspects of the leadership circle that makes it unique, that we know of on the market today, is that the leadership circle points to stages of development, stages of adult development. It also measures key leadership competencies. It's in the design framework. It also assesses beliefs and assumptions and puts that together into one integrated framework. So let me start with going through the first point in terms of stages of adult development. How many of you in the room are familiar with some of the developmental theory? Great, thank you. So for those of you not, the leadership circle relies on underpinning the leadership circle is a model that comes out of the work of Robert Kegan out of Harvard. And in the leadership circle, we talk about the stages, the evolution of the mind, the complexity of the mind, and the labels that the leadership circle uses are reactive, creative, and integral mind. Robert Kegan uses the language socialized mind, self-authoring mind, and self-transforming mind. A little bit about each one of these particular stages. In the socialized mind, we tend to, when our center of gravity is in the socialized mind, we tend to work really hard at developing relationships, at career, managing our career path, at achieving results, at gaining more skills, technical knowledge, technical competence. Our center of gravity, our frame of reference tends to be how well am I doing in the eyes of others? And so we look to the outside. We talk about this as the outside-in operating system. We look to the outside for validation in terms of how well I'm doing. And most of us start our career through the socialized mind, through the reactive mind. Enormous gifts and enormous strengths. And we'll talk about what happens when we overdial or we underdial. In the self-authoring mind, we begin to invite in choice. We begin to, from the inside out, our frame of reference is, who am I? Who am I if I'm not my role? Who am I if I'm not a father or a mother or a partner? Or So what is it inside me that actually allows me to show up on the outside and be more effective as a leader, as a parent, as a partner, in life in general? So my center of gravity tends to be purposeful and more choiceful. And my frame of reference is the inside. My self-authoring starts to come through. No longer relying for validation in the eyes of others, but more in terms of for the greater good, for the sake of the greater good. And the center of gravity, when complexity of mind boots into the self-transforming mind, is very much around becoming comfortable and actually inviting in the unexpected. Expecting the unexpected, inviting it in, delighting in ambiguity and uncertainty and volatility and complexity. And this framework says a lot about leadership effectiveness, and it underpins the framework, the leadership circle framework. So we actually talk about complexity of mind is consciousness, and that in actual fact it is the operating system of performance which evolves through various stages. So complexity of mind is the operating system of performance. How many of you remember this? You know, one day I'm going to be in a room and they're going to be people that are much, much younger, and they're going, actually I did it not long ago, and somebody said, look, I think my dad used to have a screen that looked like that. So we tend to use the analogy of what happens in our own minds. We are developmental beings. And it starts from the moment that we actually come onto the planet. We start to develop. We are developmental beings, and there are times when we hit developmental ceilings, just like DOS did in its day. Right? How many of you remember? It was like, wow, we can do all of that now compared to what we used to do before. And then the next evolution came along. And then we look at this and we go, wow, with all the applications that we want to have open now, what would happen if we were still running on DOS or the first version of Windows? What generally happens when we've got a lot of applications open? Crashes. Yeah. And so the evolution, so it's in the design, it's in the complexity behind that allows us to be more effective. And this is the model and this is how we refer to complexity of mind. That with each leap step evolution in an operating system, think our own internal operating systems, our own consciousness, our own meaning making, our own complexity of mind, that we can manage more complexity with greater ease and speed and mastery and agility. And this is where we say that the structure determines performance. Reactive orientation, socialized mind determines how we show up on the outside, both as a leader from an effectiveness perspective in the eyes of others, and for some, it's the ineffectiveness in the eyes of others. And the leadership circle model has these adult stages of development underpinning the actual model itself: reactive, creative, and integral. Creative orientation makes up and we've got a mat here on the floor, so during the break, please feel free to come up and have a look at this mat. It's got some of the detail in it. So the creative orientation tends to be in the northern hemisphere of this circle, and the reactive orientation is much more in the southern hemisphere of the circle. On the left-hand side, we see relationship, and on the right-hand side, we see task. So let me just take you through a little bit of what this construct of this model is now. Creative leadership competencies, reactive tendencies. So in addition to pointing to stages of adult development, Leadership Circle, in the construct, in the design, the founder of the Leadership Circle started to look at what are some of these key competencies and some of the major research around key competencies. We don't need, the research says that in order to be effective, highly effective as a leader, and to have extraordinary business performance, we do not need 300 to be good at 300 leadership competencies. That in actual fact, the model says that there are some very core leadership competencies, and the research tends to show that these core competencies sit into 5 key frames. So when we look at the Leadership Circle and we look at the inner circle, for those of you that have got one of the brochures open, I'm going to start on the right-hand side. And so one of the core leadership competencies in the inner circle is that of achieving. Just above that is systems awareness. The center tent pole, as it's often known, is authenticity. Just to the side of that is self-awareness and then relating. So in the inner circle, we have 5 inner circle core leadership competencies. And where we get some of the nuance and some of the juice in terms of where the change may need to be focused for each individual leader comes in the 18 outer circle creative competencies. So, points to stages of development, measures key leadership competencies, also in the design criteria, assesses beliefs and assumptions. And these beliefs and assumptions either enable or inhibit our leadership effectiveness and also business performance. And so we start to look at the reactive half of the circle, and where we see complying, protecting, and controlling. 3 outer circle reactive dimensions, 11 outer circle reactive tendencies. And when we look at the correlations between leadership effectiveness and the reactive, correlation is a negative inverse correlation. With the creative, it's a highly positive correlation. So this is, most of the leaders that we come across across the world tend to have their center of gravity. They tend to be somewhere in the journey between the reactive socialized mind or in transition into the creative self-authoring mind. And indeed, today we're finding more and more, because of the work that we've been doing around the world, that, and this isn't just the Leadership Circle, but it's often the work of some of the developmental theorists as well, that what's starting to happen is that we're seeing a lot more leaders that are in transition from creative to integral. But if I can just stay with the reactive and the creative, because when we're in that journey, whether it's between reactive and creative or whether it's creative to integral, there tends to be a tension. When our focus is on purpose, and at the same time, we still need to pay the mortgage. We still need to, put the children through school. We still want to go on holidays. We are beings who live in a commercial exchange world. When we are purpose-driven, most of us will join an organization because there is a resonance between the vision of the organization and my own internal vision and my own internal purpose. The values fit for me. And in that context, I know I can make a contribution. I know I can make a difference. And at the same time, there is the opportunity to develop my career and to move up. And in order to move up, that relies on me gaining approval from others. Herein lies the tension. Is that tension a creative tension because our focus tends to be more in the reactive structure, creative structure of mind, or is that tension a reactive tension or a destructive tension? Because we tend to, with this comes purpose, being purposeful, being purpose-driven, and at the same time, as David White says, start close in. Don't take the second step or the third, which is often what most leaders that we come across just want to get in there and fix it. Let's get on with it. We've got the quarterly numbers to meet. We've got, all these pressures going on, and then actually miss the close-in step, the one that actually does require courage, the one that requires us to look inside and go, how am I showing up? What's actually driving me here? And how is that helping me be effective or not as a leader? Another piece from David White. We shape ourselves to fit the world. And by the world, we are shaped again. How aware of the shaping? How aware are we of the world that shapes us? How aware are we of how we can shape the world? And so, what does all of this mean when it comes to leadership? Why does it matter? We did a little bit of research, taking leaders who did 2 independent assessments. One was a leadership adult stage development with Suzanne Cook-Greuter, and independently, those leaders also took a leadership circle assessment. And what we did was we correlated in terms of stage development, where were these leaders scoring, and then we looked at the leadership circle and said, what is the leadership effectiveness score of these leaders in the eyes of others? And so those leaders that were actually scoring at the reactive stage of mind, the socialized stage of mind, in the leadership circle profile, the aggregated score for leadership effectiveness was 40%. Look what happens when a leader's internal operating system boots up into the creative orientation. Look what happens to the leadership effectiveness score. From 40% to 65%. And then something extraordinary, you can see the curve, the exponential curve kicking in when a leader's mind boots up into the self-transforming, the integral level of mind. In others' eyes, these leaders are seen as being 90% effective. So one of the conclusions, and we actually know this by working with leaders and looking at business results as well as effectiveness, is that for greater effectiveness, that a leader's mind must be restructured. This is the difference that makes the difference with the leadership circle, is being able to allow that, invite the conversation. What does it mean for me? What's my context? What's my role? How can I be more effective? How can I restructure? How can I learn? How can I actually reinvent? And when we look at business performance, we also did some research back in 2005, 2006, and there were 6 metrics that we used. Almost 500 leaders were actually being assessed using the leadership circle profile, and at the back of the profile was another assessment called a business performance index. And here were the 6 metrics that we used, typical business metrics. And then there was an aggregated score looking at the highest performing organizations based on those metrics, assessed by others, and then put into the top 10th percentile. So the highest performing top 10th percentile and the lowest performing businesses bottom 10th percentile, correlations to leadership effectiveness and business performance, and these were the results. Inner circle on the left-hand side is showing the highest performing, aggregated top 10th percentile in that sample. What do you notice about the circles? One on the left, much more creative, right? The lowest performing, the bottom 10%, what do you notice about the circle? More reactive than it is creative. And this is the outer circle, which again, as I said, provides us with some nuances and some of the areas for leverage. Where can we work? When we look at leadership effectiveness and the business performance just on their own, the top 10 percentile, the highest performings, the aggregated leadership effectiveness score was 80%. For the lowest performing, the aggregated leadership effectiveness score was 30%. So, foundational principle of the leadership circle. An organization cannot perform at a level higher than the consciousness of the leadership. Foundational principle of the leadership circle. An organization cannot perform at a higher level than the consciousness of the leadership. Consciousness is the operating system of performance. In and of itself, points to stages of development, measures key leadership competencies, assesses beliefs and assumptions, and then designed into one integrated framework. Taking what was apparently disparate, disconnected bodies of work from various fields over the years, leadership research, leadership literature, some of the literature in relation to organizational development, developmental psychology, behavioral economics, psychology itself, taking those and integrating this is sitting and underpinning the leadership circle profile into one integrated framework that you see as the leadership circle. And so, to bring this to conclusion, when we talk about development, we're actually looking at the outer game and the inner game, competence and consciousness, together with complexity of mind. So the competence in terms of the outer game, our knowledge, our skills, our technical abilities, our experiences, as well as our internal operating system, our internal consciousness, the meaning-making, the decisions that we make that often tend to be invisible in the eyes of others, our own emotional intelligence, the values, the beliefs and assumptions, and our identity. Both. What's sitting? And most leadership development programs that we know of tend to focus where? Mostly. On the tip of the iceberg. So when we start to understand what is driving the operating system, we start to then begin to understand, and so do individual leaders and leaders at a collective level, start to understand and really grok it inside what's going on, why it's going on, and as a result of that, have the pathways open up for what can we do about this individually and collectively. So that's a brief overview for you of the leadership circle profile, and I'm hoping that it will serve you as we go through the rest of the day, in the presentations for the rest of the day.